Furiosa was a downright horrible Mad Max Fury Road prequel. And no, it's not because of the "oh my god, woke girl boss" shite that online commentators seem to be pushing, despite not even watching the film, or the "not my Max without Mel" calls, even though there's a thorough backstory to that doesn't involve Mel Gibson's cancellation from Hollywood, but because it actively does a massive disservice to the perfection that is 2015's Mad Max Fury Road.
Say what?
Say what?
Say
What?
Say
Wait, Vex Electronica, of all people, didn't think either of these films were feminist drivel? Nah, dude, I loved Mad Max Fury Road. In fact, I love it so much that I spent 4 hours on a panel a few weeks back discussing how deep the film is, and am currently reading the production novel Blood, Sweat, and Chrome, of which offers a ton of insight into a lot of things people get straight up wrong about Mad Max, Fury Road, and George Miller. But genuinely, 2015's Fury Road was a phenomenal film in a multitude of respects. Most significantly in that it introduced a new character into the universe that played well off of the Max we had all come to know, and presented itself as basically a silent action film for the 21st century. Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, undoes a lot of that brilliance, introducing too much dialogue, poor sets, lots of green screens, and ultimately retconning Fury Road, which even George Miller states you can watch back to back with Furiosa as one continuous 4-hour film.
Furiosa butts directly into Fury Road, so you can watch the two films as one extended 4-hour movie.
So let me take you down a road not necessarily reviewing Furiosa as a film, but instead offering you a look into why it is a poor Fury Road prequel and ultimately an unnecessary film. So spray on your chrome, buckle up, because there's going to be spoilers galore, not just for Fury Road, but Furiosa and the comics. A lot of people don't seem to know that Fury Road had an almost 20-year development history behind it before it finally debuted on the screen in 2015. In 1996, Warner Brothers executives were looking at forgotten IPs to revive in a television format, and on that list was Mad Max. Upon meeting with executives, George realized he didn't want to do a show, but instead revisit Mad Max altogether for a 4th feature film. His idea was to have a long chase scene involving human cargo, a lot of other extra stuff on top of that, and by 2000, he and a small team had more or less created what came to be Mad Max Fury Road, with almost 80% of what he drafted coming to fruition in the 2015 film. Between his work on Happy Feet and the Babe franchises, Fury Road kept getting sidetracked, despite the original Mad Max star himself, Mel Gibson, signing on in December 2002 for a $25 million paycheck, and the vision more or less ready to execute. Hell, if production had started then, there's a good chance that we might have gotten Sigourney Weaver as Furiosa.
That image will haunt me.
The Warner Brother lawsuits, additional projects, and Fox canceling the production in the mid-2000s for budgetary reasons, Fury Road kept facing a barrage of difficulties before coming back to an agreement with Warner Brothers, and production finally starting in July 2012. So what's the point in telling you all of this? Furiosa, whether you agree with the character or not, was conceptualized far before the modern movement of woke.
woke.
Her story was actually originally intended to be an anime before Miller felt that it was a story that was meant for a much larger scale. Miller's even admitted himself that Fury Road is unintentionally feminist. And I believe this statement has been taken way out of context, applying the ideas associated with 2020's feminism to those of the 90s and early 2000s feminism, where Fury Road and Furiosa were originally conceptualized. And if you remember 90s and early 2000s feminism, this was a time that gave us bands like the Spice Girls and Destiny's Child, and notable female action protagonists in films like Kill Bill, Underworld, Tomb Raider, and Resident Evil. Whether you liked any of these is not the point I'm presenting, but instead that these are characters born out of female empowerment via women taking control and improving themselves, as opposed opposed to females overtaking and emasculating males as we're used to now in 2024. Furiosa as a film continues to embody this notion, giving us a female protagonist that seeks to take control of her own life and circumstances in an effort to find redemption in Fury Road and ultimately find freedom in her 2024 prequel flick. However, the problem now lies that this latest prequel not only is a direct tie-in to Mad Max Fury Road, despite other comments from George Miller saying time and time again that the franchise has no continuity.
Yes, it's got all the films have no strict chronology. It's probably after Thunderdome, but it's an episode in the life of Max and this world. It's basically an episode, and it's us revisiting that world. Never wrote the story with any of the stories with a chronological connection.
But that it undoes a lot of the brilliance about Furiosa as a character and Fury Road as a film. On a technical level, Furiosa is a disaster. An argument can be made that for a heavily green-screened flick, it does what it can quite well. But then that does a massive disservice to every other Mad Max film, and most notably Fury Road, which prided itself in minimal effects use and was reliant on the dark desperation of a desert wasteland to emphasize its themes, symbolism, and character motivations. Unfortunately, the virus that shall not be named had a big part in the production of Furiosa.
For casting Furiosa, and this was in the pandemic time, so it sounds like you didn't even get to meet with people in person. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I was in London, and it was just as the pandemic, if you like, was announced.
Right.
In fact, and Edgar had just shown me a fine cut of Last Night in Soho.
No, he says this was like the dinner right before everything closed down.
We did, and if I remember, properly, he had a bit of kind of a flu, and I had a bit of a flu, and we thought, oh, gee, we got this. As it turned out, we didn't.
As a result, you see a lot of the film get severely toned down by an insane amount of green screens and special effects in what feels like 90% of the final product, alongside overly manufactured sets that look more like stage productions than a $168 million Hollywood flick. Fury Road, by comparison, is a visual labor of love. Storyboarding aside, many of the cast and crew have themselves come forward about how meticulous the pre-production was, with even many of the production artists stating that how for months they loved working in a wreck shop, repurposing every piece of scrap they could find to make something that fit into the dystopian desert universe of Mad Max. The props, the cast, everything looks grungy and warm, and those that are clean looking are meant to be picturesque representations of purity and beauty. The drop in quality is best seen in the depictions of Immortan Joe's war boys. During pre-production of Fury Road, Australian actress Nadia Townsend was brought in to essentially train the actors playing the war boys, dedicating 2 to 3 hours per day in a full room of 20 to 30 extras to help them build a sense of genuine camaraderie that would come through later in the film. It was almost like a cult, but the payoff can clearly be seen in the insane synchronicity, not just between moments like this,
"Who will ride with me, eternal, on the highways of Valhalla?"
but in smaller scale sequences that help subtly build up the world.
By my deeds I honor him. V8.
Aside from the atrocious drop in makeup quality.
And grain stuff! And grain stuff! And grain stuff! Man, what's this? Shit look ridiculous.
Furiosa's war boys have not even a fraction of this on-screen intensity. The one instance where we see the chrome spray that was insanely symbolic in the previous film is dulled down to what can best be described as what an overstretched whore inserting a tampon might look like. The same desperation, drive, and desires are all lost in the few scenes war boys do appear, and instead of becoming pillars of the narrative madness, they become, at best, background props, which is seen nowhere better than when Caden Biles briefly appears during the primary rig chase sequence. Poor sets, props, and makeup lead us all to one of this film's objectively biggest problems: pacing. And I don't know about y'all, but Fury Road had me on the edge of my seat throughout its entire runtime. Whether we were watching the war rig push its way through flames, or Furiosa discover everything she wanted was now lost, the film knew how to perfectly pace itself between the impressive action and sobering moments, all while presenting us with a world that didn't need to overstretch its dialogue in order to work. Fury Road averages 22.5 cuts per minute, and that's insane when you take into consideration that there was 450 hours of footage to make that happen with. And it never feels as though it's that fast, because every shot takes the opportunity to frame itself in the center, meaning that your eye is watching a fast succession of cuts without ever having to drift your central focus. All this on a film built around storyboard and visuals, and it's the lack of dialogue that ends up making Fury Road a film that still receives praise almost a decade later. Furiosa abandons a lot of this brilliance. The central focus is lost, the fast edits are abysmal, and the introduction of overdrawn dialogue creates a film that's ultimately so boring that it devolves into holding your hand through world building that nobody needed in order to understand Furiosa herself. The first act during Furiosa's kidnapping tries to mimic Fury Road's style, but does so poorly in that it never adequately establishes a tone, and the remaining 4 acts give us so much lip service that you no longer find Immortan Joe to be menacing, find his sons to be just as stupid as their names, and Dementus, who is arguably the best part of the entire film, is wasted chattering on about things that both undermine him as a legitimate villain, as well as dedicate time to conversations that mean nothing. And I mean nothing in that they don't do a good job of establishing his power, his danger, or why I as a viewer should be rooting against him for Furiosa's sake. The useless dialogue is best seen when Dementus finds the Citadel by coincidence while searching for the Green Place, and his confrontation with Immortan Joe puts focus on how silly everything is.
The Immortan has a request. Among all these warriors assembled here, choose one.
Why would I do that?
For this negotiation to go further, you must choose. At random. Any war boy. Just one.
Oh, I've got chance not to choose.
Then you'll never know the truth.
This cumbersome dialogue throws off any semblance of pacing even when the movie gets action heavy. Oh goodness gracious, the rig chase scene felt like an absolute slap in the face of Fury Road. You know when you're playing a game with an autosave feature and you die in the middle of a battle and end up respawning in the midst of that same battle, locking you into a cycle of living briefly, dying, and living again?
No, I live, I die, I live again!
I totally set that one up intentionally. The entire first rig scene felt like that. If the green screen and CGI flyers didn't already diminish the urgency of the scene, then the fact that it just seems to reload itself over and over again had me insanely bored through what was one of Furiosa's biggest character moments and the flick's most action-heavy sequence. In an attempt to mimic one of Fury Road's best moments, there's also, no dialogue, but no sense of urgency is established as there's no epic Junkie XL score, no establishing purpose to why the War Boys chose to be there, and so much CGI and editing that the potential of the sequence is even duller than a blunt pencil.
Pencil. I know, I've heard the story, sir.
Fucking pencil!
Furiosa is at best fan fiction worthy in its imagery and symbolism, as not only do they lack any significance whatsoever, but they're used to wholly retcon the previous film in order for this one to exist. Fury Road had such an insane amount of depth. From Christian iconography to Greek symbolism to the importance of unity and the quest for redemption, Fury Road embodies a lot of depth that I believe is unseen by most of its negative critics. In fact, so much is overlooked that I'm convinced at this point if Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver had starred in this in the early 2000s, nobody would have given a fuck. In attempting to build atop the Christian iconography and influence specifically, Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, presents the fruit tree and seed, alluding to a Garden of Eden analogy wherein rather than being the bane that brings an end, she's meant to be a play off of Max, who famously crushes a snake in the first Mad Max film, and is seen eating a serpent's head in the opening of Fury Road. A young Furiosa fell to her temptations in the opening sequence, and her punishment was the pain of becoming Dementus' first subordinate daughter, and later Immortan Joe's eventual bride. Now, instead of taking advantage of their R rating to genuinely explore this latter development, Miller and company instead play it very safe, undoing a pretty awesome backstory that she was given in the little-known Fury Road comic series that ran for 4 issues between May and August 2015. In one of the issues, Furiosa is also traded to Joe to become a wife, not maybe become a wife, as the prequel film implies. And much like how his other wives were in Fury Road, Furiosa was, aggressively used.
Open wide, kids, because I'm gonna grape you in the mouth!
He's going to what them in the mouth?
He's gonna grape them.
Had Miller stuck with this, as he was a writer for this comic, it would have complemented the Garden of Eden imagery he displays here, and here, far better. This specific retcon also downplays, again, why Immortan Joe is a fearful demon, a literal embodiment of death, in the way he rules, in the way he presents himself, and in what he preaches. At one point in the film, Rictus, fascinated by the charms in Furiosa's hair, takes her out of the breeder vault to play with her. She ends up escaping, and suddenly the trade Joe made for her, which was to establish peace between the Citadel and Dementus, is completely forgotten. Joe pitches no fit over it, whereas we see him use every power at his disposal to get his wives back in Fury Road, which takes place immediately after this film. Furthermore, yeah, Furiosa was sexually abused by Immortan Joe, and the only reason she never gave birth was because she was barren. As a result, he let her become a worker, and eventually she made her way up to Imperator, where she was eventually trusted enough to guard the wives that we see in Fury Road. Furiosa, the prequel, largely ignores this, and instead she just kinda unnoticeably becomes a crewmate who helped rig up a bulldozer. And that's supposed to be enough for us as an audience, regardless of whether you know the comic lore or not, to buy that this is how she ends up surviving for the next 15 years. When you have a female character that looks obviously weaker in every physical respect, it undermines the influence of your villain immensely when the lifestyle you purport in one film is nullified to allow for a prequel to happen. Later, when Furiosa just walks up to Immortan Joe in his secret lair, Joe is like, yeah, I can trust this woman that I've not interacted with whatsoever since she was a child, something I don't remember, and I legitimately have an empire where all the women I know are treated like cattle, but, fuck it, she's just making sense now. The Christian imagery is used again later in this now iconic scene that was shown in all of the trailers. One of the great things about Fury Road is that Max can be seen as a Christian savior of sorts, and it's displayed not just subtly in a number of scenes, but overtly in how his blood is literally used to usher in the redemption arcs for both Furiosa and secondary character Nukes. Much like the snake and fruit symbolism earlier in the film, this shot is meant to be a moment of Furiosa's decision to sacrifice her freedom for the man that not only took her under his wing, but that she loves, Praetorian Jack. It's meant to directly complement Max's arc in Fury Road, but inadvertently poses more issues for Furiosa's motivation. If you recall, in that film, there's a clear disdain Furiosa has for Max upon meeting him, and given the gender divide in that film, of which Miller also acknowledges, it's obvious when paired with the comic backstory why she would be so hesitant to partner with a man, let alone one that was being used for a blood flag for a convoy after her. Given that she attempts to save Praetorian Jack right before the events of Fury Road, paired with her ability to see who is in her best interests throughout the course of this entire film, this means that Furiosa should have been able to better read who's good and who's bad by the time Fury Road happens. And that's an assumption that is in line with everything we see her experience throughout the course of the prequel, from her kidnapping as a child to her rise as an Imperator. This change in character motivation ultimately leads to the climax of the prequel, where Furiosa ends up finding Dementus after the rather brutal death of Praetorian Jack, a highlight I wish the film leaned more into thematically. And they come face to face in the middle of the wasteland for what can basically be boiled down to as the interrogation scene from The Dark Knight.
No, you complete me. You're garbage who kills for money.
Despite not remembering who she is until she captures him, the two have a conversation that ultimately invalidates Furiosa's quest for revenge, which had acted as the other half of her journey to freedom. This is where the prequel, without really explaining how or why, further undoes both Furiosa as a character and Fury Road as a film. It's heavily implied that in Fury Road, Furiosa's quest for redemption is in part a result of her tortured life in the Citadel, where not only did she abide by Immortan Joe's lawlessness, but in doing so allowed for the ill fate of so many. In fact, there is a point in the Fury Road comic where Furiosa actually dislikes Joe's wives because they were complaining about their freedom, even though they were given the best life possible as a breeder in her eyes. In Fury Road, you could say that this is all left up to interpretation, but it's pretty in your face if you ask me. And the prequel decides to completely retcon it so that Furiosa's drive for saving the brides now is to replace what family she's lost. Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga. Gosh, so the marketing really assumed the intelligence of general moviegoers on that one, because too few people seem to realize that this is an offshoot, not a mainline Mad Max film, is one that could have stood better on its own had it come before Fury Road. Actually, no, scratch that. It was originally intended to be an anime at one point, and that's where it should have stayed if they were so pressed to make it. While George Miller had made the character and backstory well before the modern age of woke whammon, it's a story that didn't need to be told, as everything we needed for the character and this part of the Mad Max universe was more than enough in Fury Road. And while Furiosa doesn't count towards the 3 Mad Max films Tom Hardy is signed on for, I'm wholly worried for what the fate and quality of those films will be, as George Miller has shown us that in his 80s, despite all the truly magnificent shit he drops in interviews, might be having a bit of creative retardation in his old age. Anyways, that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for stopping by and stay frosty, friends.